If there is one franchise that has developed a reputation for having the most contrived and convoluted storytelling in the universe that is so aggressively hamstrung by its legacy and continuity that it ceases to have breathing room in other areas of narrative expansion, then that would be, well, a lot of them actually. Even the good franchises in our culture can sometimes suffer from this phenomenon.
What?
However, none of them have come close to the absolute convolutedness of the Terminator films. Why is that? And why make a video about sequel films of a franchise that has been on a downward spiral of quality ever since Arnie raised that thumbs up in the climax of the second film? Well, the simple answer is that I love the Terminator franchise. Or at least 33% of it.
Then you should be able to mate with Cal Reese in this timeline.
Okay, we're not having this conversation again.
Even though I have given my praise to the second film in my first ever video, what I do not shy away from is my love for the first Terminator film. It's a perfect film. Perfect pacing, perfect action, perfect story, perfect characters, everything about it I love. So the franchise has at least the track record of having a third of the films being memorable. Although I haven't been a fan for long. I first got introduced to the franchise at 18 simply because I just hadn't reached all of the films on my watch list yet. And for a long time, after watching them all, I resented the films that came after Judgment Day, because the general consensus on the later films was that they were really bad. The ugly truth about these films is that the components of the franchise that make it so recognizable are ultimately what is inhibiting them from evolving and progressing in a linear way, both thematically and narratively. But after every viewing of the later films and having enough time to think about it, after the release of the most recent Terminator film, Dark Fate, I do have a deeper understanding of the films. Not in a matter that paints them as cohesive or pleasing, but as a thought experiment to figure out how the lore and legacy have influenced the future stories that come from this franchise. There are exactly two contradictory pieces of dialogue in the entire franchise that basically summarizes my overall confusion and insecure feelings about the films, and they are these two.
The future's not set. There's no fate but what we make for ourselves.
You only postponed it. Judgment Day is inevitable.
These two lines have caused more damage to a franchise's storytelling than anyone I can think of. So the question is, can we resolve this contradiction? To come to even a fractional understanding of the Terminator sequels, we first need to discuss the following. What is the universal theme that loosely ties all of the films together?
The future is not set. You must be stronger than you imagine you can be. You must survive, or I will never exist.
It's fate, obviously, and to a lesser extent, legacy and heritage. Now, on a narrative level, the films are laser focused on the latter, in the form of Sarah and John Connor's story. Canonically, the films will always center the stories around them, because of the airtight lore that has been written. Sarah Connor is the mother of a boy destined to become a leader of humanity in a war against the machines oppressing them. Every film in the franchise follows at least one of the two, no matter what time frame is present. And on a thematic level, the theme of fate and legacy permeates the characters we've established. And keep in mind, fate in the context of this discussion, I'm referring to the future of mankind and the questionable line of events they choose to follow within the story, which come as a product of humanitarian invention of an artificial intelligence. Whenever the characters take the forefront, legacy permeates the story, and the theme of fate is emphasized in the form of Skynet and the future war between the two worlds. No film in the franchise breaks away from these tropes. Now, you'd think that with this airtight lore and narrow area of exploration surrounding the themes and fate and legacy of the story, the films would have a cohesive flow. But in fact, the effect is the opposite because of one universal problem: the concept of rebooting. The lore of the Terminator films has such a restricted field of navigation to adapt and develop followingly, that whenever the franchise starts to break the rules of its own lore instinctively, it clusters the narratives, and thus the origin of plot holes are brought forth. This phenomenon absolutely clouds the fifth film, Terminator Genisys. This means the only option writers have to absolve a cluttered story in the franchise is to reboot the ideas to form a clean slate of operation. But there are consequences to this. Rebooting does not just mean wiping the progress made within the narrative, but also the theme's progress. Why does Skynet keep sending back more advanced Terminators with every film where John Connor becomes more and more capable of defending himself? Well, it wouldn't make sense to target anyone who isn't the future leader of humanity. The lore and continuity restricts narrative expansion. When we get told in every film that Skynet has a new alias and creation by a separate Cyberdyne organization, we constantly have to follow the same tropes of a Connor family member going after the system to save the world. Why? Well, because the Connors are the only people aware of Skynet as a threat. I will give the sequels credit for constantly reinventing and adding new stories that add to Skynet's Terminators, like the T-3000 and the depiction of early generational Terminators in Salvation. However, these are material expansions. They don't affect the narrative on a thematic level. I think the reason the films are often confused by their thematic conversations is because what often happens with ongoing sequels is that they want to add more thematic ideas through their thesis statements, but the substance of their narratives won't always correspond. And in order to talk about that, we need to discuss the first film and the character of Kyle Reese through text and subtext.
It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear.
Now, when I'm talking about text and subtext, I'm not referring to the text and subtext of a newspaper front where the letters are all different sizes, but rather a narrative understanding of it. In a story, you can deliver exposition or dialogue in two ways, explicitly or subtly. When two characters are conversing directly over the rules of time travel, the information the audience absorbs is done textually and directly. Example 1. In Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor's first encounter, he explains to us everything about the future. Very little is said with ambiguity and the audience can directly absorb the information. That is text, when what is meant by the text and what is said by the text correspond. However, when two characters are having a discussion that implies ambiguous messages and implications that lead to a hidden idea, the information is provided to the audience through subtext. Example 2. Sarah is asking Kyle about the woman in his future and if he has someone special in his life. Textually, she is asking the stated, but subtextually, she is professing her attractional emotions to Kyle even though she doesn't explicitly say it. In The Terminator, we are told by Kyle the events that will transpire in the future surrounding humanity's fate. In the near future, humanity is destined to create a conscious artificial computer network called Skynet that commits genocide on the world when it becomes self-aware and declares every human a threat to its existence. And in 1997, 3 billion lives are wiped out in a nuclear war. From the war, John Connor becomes the leader of the human resistance that ultimately arrives to victory over the machines in the distant future. But later on, we also learn that Skynet has sent back a T-800 series Terminator to terminate Sarah Connor, John Connor's mother, before he is born to wipe him from existence. This is what we learn through Kyle on a textual level about the reason he chooses to protect Sarah. With everything that is said, Kyle's entire need in this story is based on this fate alone. If Sarah survives, John Connor can be born and humanity's fate is protected. And that is exactly what he believes on a textual reference. But this entire behavior of Kyle also gives us an idea on what he believes about fate and what the film believes on a subtextual level. And that is that fate is a cemented and unchangeable concept. Yes, he says to Sarah that the future isn't written and fate is what we make, but in reality, those aren't really his words. They're John Connor's. They were relayed through him to Sarah from John. There is even a deleted scene in the film that confirms this belief that Kyle has on a textual level.
We can prevent the war. There's nobody else.
That's not my mission.
However, given how brilliantly the film has characterized Kyle Reese's belief on fate on a subtextual level, this scene isn't really necessary, even though it is quite compelling. I think the reason this scene was left out is because the writers weren't sure how they were gonna follow up with Judgment Day, but on a character revealing level, this scene is of utmost importance to Kyle. If Kyle believed in the contrary, that fate is changeable, then Sarah Connor's death and John Connor's ill existence is irrelevant and inconsequential to the timeline. Since if fate is truly malleable and unset, then that would mean that if John Connor dies or is erased from the timeline, humanity can create their own future leader of the resistance, and by extension their own hope, their own fate. Just as Sarah Connor and John defied fate by destroying Cyberdyne systems and by extension Skynet. So that is all to be said about the first film. And the story ends not with Sarah Connor dying or arming herself with a shotgun ready for Skynet, but alive and well with a recognizable photograph in her hand, making a full circle. Then Terminator Judgment Day comes in and basically turns everything on its head by textually telling us that fate is what we make, also implying that we have free will, and the film ends with Sarah and John alive and secured in a world without Skynet. This is a full circle to the thematic narrative within the first two films. The substance of the story match the thesis statements. But referring to my previous point, the problem that lies with the ongoing sequels is that they want to continue to add more thesis statements to the theme, but the substance of their narratives don't always correspond, with one exception we'll get to later. Terminator Salvation isn't about much, given that it already takes place in a future war, but it does make an attempt to rectify towards the idea that fate is a concept that requires protection, not change, by way of Kyle's implementation. In Salvation, Skynet believes the same idea of the first film, that eliminating the parent of John Connor will erase him from existence, as they hunt down Kyle throughout the story, implying a set future. But at the same time, the story includes Marcus Wright, a human Terminator hybrid whom John Connor, and by extension the lore, isn't aware of, since Sarah Connor and the T-800 didn't mention him, implying that there is a malleability within the timeline and also fate. So what does the film believe then? Is fate malleable or is it not? Well, the answer is both, which leads to a contradiction within the story. Terminator Dark Fate, in my eyes, suffers this problem the most. Dark Fate follows directly after Judgment Day and tells us that Skynet is destroyed and the future is changed. But then directly after that, a T-800 that isn't supposed to exist shows up and kills John Connor, implying that Skynet is still inevitable. Their efforts were meaningless. But then we later find out that Skynet is truly erased but replaced by another AI network called Legion, and that there is another prophecy about a written savior of humanity. It's just very unclear what the film believes and what is set in the story. Granted, Dark Fate does have, in my opinion, the coolest and most well-developed idea of newly developed Terminators that fully make use of the updated effects, but again, these are material changes. They don't affect the theme positively. And then we have Terminator Genesis. A film entirely constructed off the idea that fate is truly not set. But there is so much happening in this film that I can't even begin. This film follows the events leading up to the events of the first Terminator, but then does a whole spiel about a new timeline constructed by Skynet, where they harnessed John Connor to become a new Terminator so he could safeguard Skynet's creation 20 years later, while an original Kyle Reese teams up with a mature Sarah Connor and an old T-800, which don't make sense, because they believe in the original timeline, while at the same time Sarah is rescued and raised by a T-800 in the distant past and not in 1991. Holy shit, that is a lot to take in. And by this time, what the audience could take away from the film is completely lost in rebooting. The substance of the story is just way too insane and crazy to follow any thematic leniency. There is actually only one film from the ongoing sequels that actually has a straight answer for its thesis statement while having a story that corresponds. That is none other than Rise of the Machines, the third film. Rise of the Machines takes place a few years after Judgment Day, where John Connor has come to the belief that Skynet has truly been destroyed, and that fate has been changed. Then we are told this by the Terminator.
You only postponed it. Judgment Day is inevitable.
A new thesis statement has taken hold, and throughout the film our characters go back and forth and fight through military defenses, a Terminatrix designed to destroy other Terminators, and a corrupted T-800. We are led to believe that every sacrifice, every step further by the characters bring them closer to destroying Skynet. And when they arrive at the system core, ready to blow it up with C4, this happens.
There's nothing here. This is a fallout shelter for VIPs.
There is no system core, and their efforts have been meaningless, but it fits within the thesis statement of the film. It's not a very satisfying nor a crowd-pleasing ending, but it is a sound one that completes a full circle, stating that our characters aren't meant to change fate, but to survive and to protect it.
Should have realized
Our destiny was never to stop Judgment Day. It was merely to survive it.
Rise of the Machines is far from my favorite entry in the franchise. Though I think it is also the cheesiest and most forgettable film, I can definitely appreciate the intent of making a full thematic circle within a story that didn't necessarily need one.
The battle has just begun.
The next point in the discussion I want to make is less of a critique and more of an observation I came to when writing the script, which is the concept of time travel. Fitting for the discussion of the Terminator, as the franchise is no stranger to this concept. Time travel as a theory has some scientific relevance in our reality. It's uncertain how much, as we don't have any physical evidence of it as a living concept outside of the theories delivered to us by mathematicians such as Einstein, but still, the theoretical evidence we have of it is sound enough to be believable. However, in our day and age now, time travel has become more of a fictional study in our filmography and stories. Some films like Interstellar utilize a scientifically relevant form of time travel in their stories, and while it's more fictional, Avengers Endgame had a story that was supervised by a group of scientists regarding its theories of time travel. However, the concept itself has evolved into more fictional territories because of the desire of writers to create more stories that utilize this concept and start to add more fictional theories behind it. Think of it as a Wikipedia Bible that houses these ideas, and through the years, writers have used these principles to cohesify and contextualize their stories. It's very easy to create new theories of this concept in a fictional form because, well, as the man once said,
Einstein said time is relative, right? Maybe I'm not late. Maybe you guys are early.
Though there may have been many before it, the Back to the Future films are probably the most popular early example of films that had a very thorough study of the concept. And after that, many more came to be. In fiction, time travel has a lot of differentiating principles. I'll only be going into detail on the relevant ones for this discussion, and I'll leave a brief description on the screen if you want to pause and read it. But among many others, they are as follows: consequential paradoxical time travel, inconsequential paradoxical time travel, the Navikov principle of self-consistency, precognitional time travel, and time loop films. I mention all of this because the relationship the Terminator films have with time travel is interesting, as it mainly seeks to explore two of the previously mentioned principles: the Navikov principle of self-consistency and consequential paradoxical time travel. The Navikov principle of self-consistency is a study of linear temporal causality, where if any written event or significance in the timeline is influenced and entirely dependent on the effect of that time-traveling occurrence, then that occurrence is obsolete and is written into the timeline itself. Okay, so that was quite a lot to take in. So what does that mean? Well, in basic form, it's the chicken and egg scenario. If my future self travels back to my present to make a change that influences my life in a way that will lead to that very moment where my future self started with, I end up becoming part of that future because of my future self traveling back in time. If you're struggling to think of an example, look no further than the Time Turner plotline from Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. In this plotline, there are two perspectives shown to us in relation to the events that had transpired with Harry, his friends, Lupin, and Black. We are shown in one perspective that Harry and his friends are motivated by certain unexplained occurrences, like the throwing of rocks against Harry's head and Harry being rescued by an unknown face. These occurrences compel them to move forward from one area to another, and once they have moved through all of the written events within the narrative, they travel back in time to create the very occurrences that originally compelled them to move through all of the events within the narrative along. It's an endless loop of a self-consistent narrative. The cause and effect are mutually codependent. The only question is, which came first, perspective 1 or 2? Now, in the Terminator films, there are two plot lines that act as examples of this theory, with Kyle Reese and Skynet. One of the first questions I asked when watching the first film was this: is Kyle actually John's father, or is it originally someone else? Well, within the laws of Navikov, he is. Kyle gets sent back to the past to father his son John, who inevitably becomes the person who sends him back to ensure his existence. the entire loop between them is codependent. Our second example lies within the creation of Skynet. In the future, it isn't explicitly stated how Skynet came to be, just that humanity tried to reach too close to the sun that they ended up burning themselves with Skynet's creation. And in the future, Skynet sends back a Terminator to provide themselves a better chance at wiping John out of existence. But we also learned in the second film that Skynet also may have sent back the Terminator to ensure their own creation, whether they knew about it or not. In Judgment Day, the scientists who invented Skynet did so by analyzing the remnants of the first Terminator that was sent back. So what happened first? Was Skynet invented because of the first Terminator, or was the first Terminator invented because of Skynet? Well, as previously discussed, both of them happened. A self-consistent loop of events. Consequential paradoxical time travel is the most commonly explored form of time travel, both in fiction and the franchise itself. The basic idea is that any change you make in a timeline, no matter its effect, is... You know what? I'm just gonna let the man himself explain it.
This line represents time. Prior to this point in time, somewhere in the past, the timeline skewed into this tangent, creating an alternate 1985.
That is the basic idea. That you can change the timeline by making a change in the past. When Sarah and John destroy Cyberdyne systems, they also destroy Skynet in the future, creating a whole new timeline. You don't have to think hard to find more examples. It's present in Genesis with a New Future, where Genesis brings forth Skynet, and in Rise of the Machines, Skynet comes into existence in 2003, 6 years after it originally was meant to be. Lastly, in Dark Fate, Legion is the new replacement for Skynet in a new alternate timeline. But what I find most interesting is that this theoretical principle is not just something used by Cameron to cohesify his story, but it's also a way to express the thematic ideology of the film. As in, if fate is genuinely set and not able to change, the Novikov self-consistency principle fits in pretty nicely. This theory suggests that fate is inevitable and that we live in a prescripted timeline of self-consistency, where every event must adhere to a specific chronology and nature that it flows accordingly to the timeline. While at the same time, the theory of consequential paradoxical time travel tells us that fate is an ever-changing constant, and in the narrative that the characters are capable of not only changing their fate, but also creating their own. Changes that are personified by these alternate timelines and paradoxes. And when I view the Terminator sequels in this way, as these different chronicles of alternate timelines, where Sarah Connor fights a new Skynet, or one where John Connor encounters a human Terminator hybrid, or where a mature Sarah Connor played by a brunette supermodel partners up with a quippy T-800, then I guess I'm fine with their existence. I just can't connect with them if the only solution they settle towards is a constant rebooting and reworking of their own stories. As I said previously, I definitely appreciate the new addition from these films. The Rev 9 is by far the coolest modern take on the Terminator, and really benefited off of the updated effects. Seeing a fully realized future war with a fully mature John Connor is really cool and exciting. And I've already explained what works so well about Rise of the Machines. And Genesis sure has something. It has pops. I don't know, what y'all think?